I figured I'd come in and at least introduce the second lecture here. For this lecture, we're going to dive into the Renaissance proper and a particular moment of time referred to as the High Renaissance. Some significant events that take place during the Renaissance. So in 1453, you have the Ottoman Empire, which was a Muslim empire, conquers what is left of the Byzantine Empire. Consider that the Byzantine Empire was the last remnants of ancient Rome, and it didn't completely fall until 1453. It was in place for a good long while. In 1492, you've heard it. Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. You've heard it. It's 1492 that Christopher Columbus discovers, quote unquote, the Americas. I put that in quotations because, of course, he didn't discover the Americas. He wasn't even the first European to even arrive in the Americas. However, we're all aware of the expedition of Columbus to try to but to try to cross around from Europe, going westward around the earth to get to India and try to open up a trade with that direction in order to avoid all the difficulties and dangers that were with going overland from Europe across Asia into India and landing in the Americas, and all of the exploration, conquering, and imperialism in the Americas that followed it. From 1519 to 1522, there was this expedition by Ferdinand Magellan, who becomes the first European to circumnavigate the world, beginning at Europe and working his way all the way around, going westward first, moving down South America, finding a small sort of passage, an inlet, if you will, that allowed them to cut their ships through sort of the tail end of the southernmost tail end of South America, on up to the Philippines, and then around the Cape of Good Hope of Africa, back up. As you can see, it took a number of years to do, but he becomes famous for that, Magellan being Spanish. In 1534, you have King Henry VII, who founds the Anglican Church, and that's particularly interesting because of the way that it sort of challenged the Catholic Church. In 1543, you have Copernicus, who develops the heliocentric model of the universe. And we'll talk about what heliocentric means in a moment. Some more significant events. Specifically, we'll focus on the Protestant Reformation. So 1517, you have Martin Luther. This is him pictured here in both of these images that you see here, who in 1517, Martin Luther was a German. The story goes, it's debated as to whether he actually did this or not, but the story goes that he nailed what are referred to as his 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg Castle in Germany. We know that these 95 Theses were written, and that they were written grievances against the Catholic Church. And so from 1517 to around 1600, Martin Luther's actions here of writing these 95 Theses, which again are going to outline his grievances with the Catholic Church, launches what is known as the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation, Luther's position, and this is the position of most of the Protestant faiths that spring forth from Martin Luther, from what Martin Luther starts here, is that the Bible should be the primary text of Christianity. Martin Luther had a lot of issues with things that were happening in the Catholic Church that seemed to be dogma, but when he was flipping to the Bible, he was like, wait a minute, I don't see this anywhere. Martin Luther was a Catholic priest and was starting to notice inconsistencies in Catholic orthodoxy and things that he was reading in the Bible. This is his position. And the second point of the Protestant position here is that personal salvation should be attainable without intermediaries. Because the Catholic position at the time, and to a certain extent now, is that an individual could not advocate for themselves in asking for forgiveness directly to God. Instead, you needed to pray to someone else who would then speak to God on your behalf. Either you go and speak to a priest, hence confession, when one confesses to a priest. That priest who does have that direct line to God then will pray to God on your behalf to forgive you of those sins. Or if we're not praying for forgiveness, but we're praying for other things that we would like to have in our lives, things that would improve our station in life. We're praying for health. We're praying for our crops to have a good yield. We're praying for our children to survive, I don't know, smallpox or something, right? Again, you couldn't advocate on your own behalf. You could not pray directly to God. So you could bring that to a priest, or you could pray to a saint. You would pray to a saint who is someone who is already in heaven. So we know that that person is there. We pray to that person who will then go and speak to God on our behalf. And Martin Luther took umbrage with those ideas, but also how it was being abused, that the Catholic Church was also using that as a money-making scheme. One of his big issues was with the buying of indulgences. An indulgence is when you would pay a priest, pay the church, to go ahead and pray to God to forgive you of a sin you had not committed yet. Or again, where one who was poor might go to a priest, and give a confession, and then the priest says, okay, go say, 24 Hail Marys, mend your relationship with that person that you hurt, what have you. Go do those things as penance. Right? One who has money might go to confession and just pay money and say, I don't want to confess my sins. Go ahead and forgive them for me. And the church was indulging in this kind of thing, and it bothered Martin Luther. Now, Martin Luther himself, don't get me wrong. Martin Luther himself has a complex and problematic history as a human being. Right? There's plenty. He was no perfect human being himself. And in fact, a lot of his writings, he could write some of the most scathing, horrible insults of those that he felt had either wronged him or were in some way participating in the wrongs that he saw the church doing. Oh, he could write some of the. There is. Oh, I can't think of the. I can't think of the URL for the website now. There's a website where you can ask to be, you click on a button and ask to be insulted by Martin Luther, and you get some horrible string of words where he just insults your intelligence or insults your breath or whatever. And they're just using quotes from things he wrote himself. But, so I want you to understand that I'm not trying to by any means place Martin Luther on some high pedestal. Right? I'm only explaining what he saw as being problematic within the church. Now, he wanted to just reform the church. He was a priest, after all. He wasn't trying to completely form a new denomination. But, I thought I had a point about this. But unfortunately, because he wouldn't stop with this stuff, he was excommunicated from the church, and he says, fine, then, I'm going to go and form my own denomination, and he forms the Lutheran denomination. Others follow, the Calvinists, the Anglican church that we just talked about is one of them. Lots of Protestant faiths start popping up out of this. And it spreads its message quickly, specifically because it's only a few decades after the invention of the printing press. And the printing press was invented up north in Germany. So this begins to spread very quickly through the printed material. And as such, I thought I was going to point about this, but as such, there's a big emphasis in Protestant faith at this time for literacy and to read. And the whole, as Paul would put it, to work out your own salvation, right? To read and understand and know for yourself so that someone doesn't take advantage of you. In this case, it would have been, the thinking here would be the Catholic Church. Don't let them tell you what's in that Bible. Go and read it for yourself. And so there's lots of printed material that gets passed around. And so the Protestant message spreads extremely quickly, particularly in the north. It'll eventually trickle its way down into Italy, but Italy, for the most part, stays pretty strongly and pretty firmly Catholic. Since we spend a lot of our time together, you and I, talking about art, an important point is perhaps not so much a check mark in favor of the Protestant movement. What was maybe a bit more of a darker stain on the record is that there was widespread what we call iconoclasm. The iconoclasm that takes place during the Protestant movement destroyed many medieval and early Renaissance works of art because there were a lot of people amongst some of those early Protestant faiths who saw the images inside Catholic churches and cathedrals, the stained glass windows, the paintings, the chalices that were all bejeweled, as idolatry, and as such, something to be suspicious of. And so a lot of Protestants would go into churches, rip things down, destroy it, burn the artwork, and we've lost a huge amount of the late medieval, early Renaissance kind of artwork that was done at the time to that iconoclasm. Now, we talked about the heliocentric model of the universe. Now, granted, we understand now that our solar system is just one part of the larger universe, and none of that stuff revolves around our sun. But at the time, this was the way of thinking, the geocentric model of the Earth, of the universe, really, was that this idea that the Earth was the center of the universe and everything else in the sky revolved around the Earth. This was because the Earth, it was a religious way of thinking, because if God created the Earth and if everything happened the way Genesis describes it, and the Earth was formed and everything else was put up in the firmament above, then it must all move around the Earth because we are the important thing, right? We Earthlings, we humans, the things that God created, very important. But then you see, though, in order to make that work, what it requires, the model requires for all the planets to be going in wildly erratic patterns, spinning and doing loop-de-loops, right? Because from our viewpoint, as we are looking up at the sky, at the planets as they go by, right, we now know that the heliocentric model is correct. The fact that it was believed that the entire universe revolved around the sun isn't necessarily correct, but we know that in our solar system, all of the planets move around the sun. They're not all revolving around the Earth. So we know this to be the correct model. But it's not as if all the planets are moving around in exactly the same speed, right? Some move faster, some move slower, and some have much larger ellipses to move around. And so we're kind of like, we're all on a racetrack. And as we're going around that racetrack, so to speak, some planets will begin to look like they're catching up and moving past you and then back up again and you move on ahead, right? And so to compensate for what we observe in the sky, this was the model. Well, Copernicus comes along making his observations and realizes that what actually makes sense, and when he sort of places the sun in the center of the universe, all the observations make sense, is this, again, this heliocentric model of the universe, that the sun is actually the center of it all. Now, that's going to cause some big problems, not so much for Copernicus, but will a little bit later for a man by the name of Galileo Galilei, who is also going to make the same claim, backing it up with lots of observations. That's going to get him in trouble with the Catholic Church. But we'll talk about that more in depth later. All right, so now we get into this brief period known as the High Renaissance. The period that's marked by, or it's considered by historians to be the moment when Europe completely emerges out of the Middle Ages into the Renaissance proper. So what defines the High Renaissance? Again, as I mentioned, it's a brief period spanning from roughly from 1490 to 1520. That's the marker is 1520, specifically in Italy. It's so marked because Leonardo da Vinci, who we'll talk about in a moment, died in 1519. Raphael died in 1520, and that's sort of seen as the end of all of this that we're about to talk about. This was a time where things were just right. The demand and the supply were exactly what was needed. Right? There were many wealthy patrons, especially the church. Now the church is sort of springing back at this point, who have a high demand for art at the very moment that there was a new generation of quote-unquote genius artists who emerged on the scene. It was during the High Renaissance that we get the first period in Western art when artists are elevated to celebrity status. Like these people that we're talking about, there's a reason you know their names even if you don't know much in the way of art. Right? There's a reason that all of the Ninja Turtles were named after Donatello, who was like a couple generations before, and then these guys that we're going to talk about today. Also, it's during this time that the concept of the Renaissance man became prevalent. The concept of the Renaissance man is sort of the jack of all trades, leaving out the whole master of none part. The idea of the Renaissance man was someone who was involved in lots of intellectual pursuits at once. So artists also saw themselves as scientists and philosophers. And there were all these innovations that were being pushed by artists, by scientists, by whomever, to exceed the accomplishments of the ancients. Not just looking back and copying what they had done, but see if we can't push what they've done even further. And the Renaissance man, by trying to not be good at just one thing, but being good at multiple things, was seen as a means of accomplishing that. During this particular time, Florence becomes unstable. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, the church, which was wealthy and is now regaining a little bit of its power, Florence and the church are going to be butting heads. Florence sort of sees themselves as David to Rome's Goliath, right? And they're constantly butting heads. In this newly wealthy church, you have a couple of popes, Popes Julius II and Leo X, who, interestingly, was a Medici, who are commissioning vast amounts of art and architecture, trying to showcase the power of the church and to be used as propaganda, because during this time, there's all that unrest that's happening in the north with the Protestant movement, right? Now, what are the characteristics of High Renaissance art? How can we recognize it when we see it? Well, there's no one specific style that defines the High Renaissance. But there are a few common characteristics that are, again, common enough that we can note them. These artists, as I said, they're sort of in a class of what are considered genius artists, and in addition to that, they are considering themselves to be Renaissance men. In addition to that, they're these huge celebrities in their time, and their work shows itself through things like extreme technical skill, an understanding of ancient Greek and Rome, ancient Greece and Rome, though they're going to try to outdo the accomplishments of ancient Greece and Rome, mathematically balanced compositions. That's something that's being pulled somewhat from ancient Greece and Rome, but their obsession with it is it goes beyond anything that the ancients did. They're going to idealize the human figure, again, an ancient Greek and Roman thing. And then, again, Renaissance men, they're going to blend science and philosophy and art. Through things like optics, so you're going to have artists like Leonardo da Vinci who are into the effects of light, geometry, all of that, all those mathematical compositions, anatomy, they get really interested in the inner workings of the body, because that needs to come into play. There's something called the four humors. Now, this is more of a medieval thing, where it was sort of believed that your temperament, or whether or not you were healthy or sick, depended upon four bodily fluids, and if any of those were out of proportion, that those became known as the four humors. And there's nothing for me to dive into all of that. It would take up too much time to try to talk about all that. But it was sort of understood then that the facial expressions, the color of the skin, the way that one carried themselves when they were being affected by any one of those four bodily fluids being out of balance was something that you could portray in art to very quickly impart to a viewer that character's motivations, how they're feeling, whatever, right? You could really quickly communicate those kinds of things. They like to bring in Greek philosophy, and they like to play around with questioning the nature of reality. Chief among them, and really the patriarch of the group, he's the oldest of these genius artists who arrive in the High Renaissance. Leonardo da Vinci actually straddles the line between the two. He's got some of his work that's very firmly in the early Renaissance, but he lived long enough that what's considered his genius work really happens in the High Renaissance. He was born in Vinci, hence Leonardo da Vinci. His name is literally Leonardo of Vinci. But he was trained in Florence, so he got trained under all that good Florentine art that was happening at the time. But interestingly, Leonardo da Vinci, for as much as he is remembered as this great genius artist at the time, that was not the main thing that he tried to advertise himself as. He constantly traveled the Italian states, and eventually went up to France as well, constantly looking for work amongst the royalty and the political elites of different city-states and kingdoms to saying, hey, hire me on as, sure, an artist, but also a scientist, a musician, an architect. He even would sell himself as a military engineer, and oftentimes it would be those other things that he would mention first in his letters that he would write. He'd be like, hey, hire me on, I'll design some really great military machinery for you, and by the way, I happen to kind of also be an artist. It's a thing I do. It's interesting that he didn't always necessarily see art as the top tier thing that he should be known for, at least. But he has these two extremely important contributions to oil painting, sfumato and chiaroscuro, which we'll dive into in a moment. Interestingly, however, Leonardo was the consummate procrastinator. Leonardo was a huge procrastinator. It's amazing that what we have of his we consider so amazing and so genius, because in his time he was seen as a guy who just could not get his work done. So as a result, very few of Leonardo's finished paintings have survived, because since he involved himself in so many pursuits, he actually rarely completed any of his work. As I just said a moment ago, he was a consummate procrastinator. In fact, there are several recorded accounts of complaints by patrons about Leonardo's slow progress on work, some of which he took a decade or even more to actually finish. And in fact, some of them he just never finished. He'd get started on a piece, get interested in something else, walk off, and not finish the thing. Sometimes people would threaten to never pay him again, and he'd come back and try to work on it for a while, maybe get paid, and then move on. Sometimes he'd just kind of be like, I've moved on from that. Leonardo for you, man. So, as such, there are a lot of his paintings that are still in an unfinished state, and most of his surviving work can be found in his notebooks, in which he researched, wrote, and drew for several decades, all the way up into his death. And in it, as I mentioned, these are his greatest surviving contributions to art, but also he has a lot of notations in there of from military engineering and strategy, as well as inventing things. You see this little image over here from his notebooks where he invented something that was not unlike a helicopter. It would have, if it had ever been built, it was meant to operate in a very similar way. It's just that it would have been powered by human beings, and so it's not exactly a viable means of flying. But he tried. up here, so you see, these are all excerpts from his notebooks. Up here, we have what he called his ornithopter, right? And it was a planned flying machine where a person would climb in here. They'd have their feet in these stirrups here, and they'd grab their these handles towards their hands, as you can sort of see happening in here. And by sort of pumping those with both feet and hands, get the wings flapping. I once watched a thing where a documentary where they built this to his specifications, and they did manage to kind of get it off the ground. It's just that it took so much effort for the person who was inside it to keep on moving. This up here is what would have kind of operated not unlike a helicopter. But he was also very interested in anatomy. You can see him here studying muscular structure and thinking about the way a child is positioned in the womb. There's a kind of an interesting story of Leonardo da Vinci hanging out with this really, really old friend of his when the really, really old friend just died of old age right there, just in the middle of a conversation. And it made Leonardo da Vinci think, well, I wonder what causes a person to die of old age. And he dissected his friend and made notes and discovered some things that were sort of built up around the heart and things. And a lot of his anatomical drawings were studied for centuries afterward. And in some cases, there's some of these drawings he made are still in anatomical books to this day. And then down here in the, down here in the lower right, we've got some of his military designs that he came up with, where he developed something not exactly unlike a tank and another way of making a man on a horse even more deadly. Now, there's no evidence any of these things ever were actually built. But a lot of these designs in his notebooks over the years. And one of his most famous notebook pages is this piece titled The Vitruvian Man, that was drawn somewhere between 1485 and 1490. It's called The Vitruvian Man. That's what it's been titled. He didn't necessarily title it that, because it's based on the ideas of the ancient Roman architect Vitruvius, who believed that the perfect human body with the perfect geometric proportions should fit perfectly inside a square, inside a circle. Right? So this is Leonardo da Vinci playing around with some of those mathematical proportions that I talked about back when we were talking about ancient Greek art, but also looking at some of the ideas of a later Roman architect. And you can see him making the marks of where proportions markers should be and things of that nature. And how, again, if a human being spreads their arms out, they're supposed to be able to fit inside of a square, inside of a circle. Another interesting thing about Leonardo da Vinci is the dude just went his own way. He was born left-handed into a world that just... Our current world, any of you who are left-handers know our current world still isn't very, very well built for left-handers to navigate. But in the 15th century, it most definitely was not one that was made to be navigated by left-handers. And if you, as a left-hander, and this is normally I ask people to raise their hand if they're a left-hander, you lefties know one of the frustrations of writing is that you're writing in the way that's been developed by a people who are majority right-handed to write from left to right. And when you do that, that means that your hand is just scooting right along what you've written, and you end up smearing it. Well, Da Vinci said, screw that noise, I'll just write backward. And if you look at this writing, you can see he's not writing left to right. He's over here starting at the right and writing from right to left in a way of writing that has to be viewed with a mirror. It's called mirror writing for that reason. Just one more thing with Da Vinci. Now, so like I said, in his paintings, he developed two techniques that have been very important part of painting ever since: chiaroscuro and sfumato. Chiaroscuro, as it says here, is an Italian term which literally means light, dark. Chiaro, light, scuro, dark. Chiaroscuro, light, dark. In painting, it refers to clear contrasts which are often used to suggest the volume and modeling of subjects depicted. Right? This is a really strong contrast between light and shadow. You got extremely bright areas and extremely dark shadows without a lot of detail, right? As if the subject were emerging out of darkness into some light. We'll look at examples. Sfumato, fun word to say, is an Italian term that means smokiness. And in painting, it refers to the blending of edges to create a realistic, soft focus. Right? So, unlike what we saw Giotto doing, right, where he was looking at old Roman sculpture that was still hanging around and noticing the really strong contrast between the light areas and the shadows areas, he's certainly not going as strong as chiaroscuro, but still, right, he's got these very clearly defined area of light and a very clearly defined area of shadow. Sfumato thinks about having a bit more of a soft gradient between that light and that shadow. And that is truer to what our eyes see. What he's thinking about with sfumato, and why it's called smokiness, is that during much of the Middle Ages, it was believed that we saw things not because, as we know now, light hit objects and then that light bounced back into our eyes. In the Middle Ages, there was this strange belief that our eyes actually shot out invisible beams that hit the things that we're looking at, and when those beams came back to our eyes, that's how we registered what we were seeing. And Leonardo da Vinci here is saying, no. We see things because light hits objects and then light comes into our eyes. And between what we're looking at and our eyes, there is air. And that air has particles in it. And so when light hits an object, it's then filtered through all those particles before it gets to our eyes. And that makes the edges of things a lot softer than we might necessarily think that we're perceiving when we look at things. So, looking at this example of his Madonna of the Rocks from circa 1483 to 1490, this explores his interest in optics. We have things like that chiaroscuro that we were talking about, right, where these figures are emerging out of very dark, shadowy surroundings, right? And we have these really strong light areas that separate out from the darkness of the surroundings. That's chiaroscuro, right? It's this very pronounced contrast of light and dark. It models the figure, again, with extremely dark shadows, but also really bright highlights. Sfumato, or smokiness, that is that blending of colors and edges on the painting, to give it a realistic soft focus. We can see that happening, let's say, in things like this angel's face right here, where there's the light of the face, and again, there's this chiaroscuro effect, because this angel is emerging out of the darkness around her. But if you'll notice, he's paying attention to things like the fact that how the light hit the shoulder, and then it bounced back up into that cheek area, right? And as such, there's a little area right there that's just ever so slightly brighter than the shadowy areas on either side of it. So there's this gentle gradient between those things, right? And this, by the way, is due to the fact that Leonardo da Vinci has been looking at what's being done in Northern Europe at the time, and he likes their oil painting. So he's one of the first to bring oil painting back down into Italy. Most of what we've been looking at thus far in Italy was done in tempera. That was still being used in the south. And with oil paint, since the paint dries so much more slowly, he can blend those edges a lot better. Now, other things about this that are clearly high Renaissance is the mathematical composition. He has all of the main figures arranged in a pyramid shape. And pyramids are a big shape that mathematically that the high Renaissance artists love. There's also a lot of math going on in how the figures interact with one another, right? There's things like Mary, or Madonna, it's Italian, whose eyes take us down this way toward, I think, John the Baptist. I believe this is supposed to be Jesus. He's throwing up a peace sign. He's giving us our blessings. That seems to be Jesus. All right. Who then takes us over here to Jesus, up to the angel. The angel looks out at us, but then points us back over here, right? And there's this hand that sort of hovers over both this hand and this head down here. There are these lines that direct us all over the place throughout this piece. But also because Da Vinci considered himself a Renaissance man, he also studied botany. And people have studied the plants that he included and have discovered that they're all botanically correct to the species that they're supposed to be. Interestingly, also, this is one version of many. He did several versions of this painting for several different patrons, and they're all in various degrees of completion. And some of them look very different in the composition, and they think that could be because in some cases he didn't finish them, or in other cases he wanted to walk away, but it was demanded by the patron that you need to finish this. So he completed it, but without some of the details that some of the earlier versions of it had. Yeah, he was quite the procrastinator. The Last Supper, this is a piece you've probably seen a million times, and I don't want to dive too much into it because we've got so much that we're having to cover. This lecture could go on forever because I love the High Renaissance. But again, let's look at the details that point out to us that this is a piece of High Renaissance art. 1495 to 1498 took him 3 years to do this thing because he kept walking away from it and then having to come back. And you'll see that it's in kind of poor condition. Right? Because again, Leonardo da Vinci considered himself this innovator. He believed that he had figured out a new technique for making frescoes. This is a fresco using oil paint, which no one was doing because oil paint didn't take to wet plaster very well. Right? So there weren't frescoes happening using oil paint. But he thought he had figured out a new technique that would allow him to use oil paint and a plaster that wasn't completely wet. He put the plaster down, actually let it cure quite a bit before putting the paint on. And pretty much he finished it, and within months, the thing started flaking off the wall. And so to this day, it's in pretty bad condition because, I mean, they try to do as many restorations on it as they can, but it just keeps flaking off that wall all these hundreds of years later. Then we see that there's a mathematical composition going on, right? Where again, everybody, he took the scene, right? This is the scene at the Last Supper where Christ has just announced that one of the 12 disciples is going to be the one who betrays him. And they're all suddenly saying, what, is it me? There are those who are directly asking him, like this group here, who's asking him, like, is it me? And others who are like discussing it, like, who could he possibly be talking about? All right, mathematical composition. He has everybody split up in such a way as that the 12 disciples are split up into 4 groups of 3, and that each group kind of makes a little bit of a triangle. Right? Sort of, it's not perfect in all cases. Jesus himself is in the center as a triangle. So there's all that math that's happening, right? Then he's using linear perspective in a means to draw our attention to a very specific spot, right? He's given us this room where all of the lines of the perspective go to a vanishing point that is right here at Christ's head. Right? So it draws us inward and makes this feel like an extension of the space we're standing in, but also takes our attention straight where it needs to be, right? He's also given us some number stuff. Like there are again, there's threes all over the place, right? These four groups of three, the triangle, the three-sided triangle of Christ, the three windows back here, three being the number of the Trinity, things of that nature. And he's also giving us some storytelling in that here's Judas, which, who, by the way, it is certainly a problematic thing of excuse me, medieval and Renaissance depictions of the Last Supper. That Judas is usually dark-skinned. It's problematic, I know, but there he is, dark-skinned and holding his bag of silver. This is Peter here leaning over to John the Baptist. John the Baptist is always shown as very young, and he's usually shown as just absolutely being unable to handle the information that he's just heard from Jesus. So this is John the Baptist just about to faint, and Peter over here trying to get his attention and getting him to ask, hey, can you, since Jesus really seems to like you, can you ask Jesus who he's talking about, that kind of a thing. One last thing is this is an innovation of Da Vinci that would then be used by other artists. Normally, when the Last Supper was presented to us, it would be done in such a way where some of the disciples might have their back to us because it was artists trying to figure out, like, I've got to get everybody around this table. Leonardo da Vinci realized that he could instead take the table and make it just like you are being presented with the bread and the wine of communion, as if the table were the table that one symbolically approaches when they go to the altar to take communion. So this side is left empty, this whole entire side of the table, because why would it be? Why would they all be hanging out on one side of this table so cramped? It's because this side of the table is for us. An excellent example of sfumato is the Mona Lisa. In this painting, the Mona Lisa, probably his most famous painting, we see some chiaroscuro for sure, right? These areas down in here are so dark, we can barely see any details in there. And think about this, that is very different than what was being done in the north, right? With people like Jan van Eyck, who, they wouldn't have done something like that, right? They would have included every single little tiny bitty detail that would have been in that shadowy area. But Da Vinci says, no, that's not how our eyes see, right? When light hits our eyes adjust to that light, and certain areas get pushed really dark, and we don't see as much detail in that. That happens, say, when we walk from a very very bright outdoors area and then step inside, there's that brief moment where we can't see a lot of the details, or if we're in a dimly lit room, but there's one thing that's nice and brightly lit, well, where the light hits it, we see it really well, but in the shadowy side, a lot of detail gets lost. He's playing around with that. He wants us to see things in that way. That's chiaroscuro. The sfumato we get in the very delicate gradients from light to shadow, right? Where there's this light area on her cheeks, but then look at how softly it's blended until you get to the shadow area, right? There's this really gorgeous little gradient that's happening there, as opposed to, again, what we saw with, say, Giotto, where Giotto probably would have given us one harsh shape of light there and one harsh shape of shadow there, right? It would have just been two shapes of color right next to one another. He's blending that edge, giving us that impression of how light hits an object, in this case a face, travels back through particles of air, comes into our eyes. The focus is then softer as a result. And so all right, let's address the elephant in the room, because everybody always talks about the mysterious smile of the Mona Lisa, right? And what is it exactly that she's smiling about, right? Well, we don't know exactly why everyone looks at her and thinks of her as having some sort of a mysterious grin happening, right? Honestly, if I come here and come in much more tightly on her face, right, her mouth really doesn't have a huge amount of expression on it, right? Just the corners of it are just ever so slightly starting to turn upward. Well, what seems to be happening are two things. One thing that we know is that Leonardo da Vinci is playing around with perspective a little bit, and whether he meant for it to or not, or if this was an unintended consequence, we don't know for sure. But if you look on either side of the Mona Lisa, you'll note that we have two different perspectives happening. One here, where it looks like we're really high above the landscape looking down, and this one, look, where our horizon seems to be here, and it looks like that we're much lower. And so there are these two different perspectives, and what we know is that there's something about the torque of those two perspectives twisting in our brains that want to feel like they're tugging at the Mona Lisa's the corners of her mouth, which makes it seem as if she's just about to start smiling. But then secondly is the fact that this painting, by the way, Leonardo da Vinci did for the husband of the woman in this painting. And then he himself liked the painting so much, he never gave it to the guy. He kept this painting with him, and it traveled everywhere he did. And when he was eventually hired to work for the French royal court, it went with him there when he died in France. That is why this painting by Leonardo da Vinci is in the Louvre in Paris to this day. He never gave it to the guy. There was also more of it at some point. It's been cut down over the years, sadly. You can sort of see the remnants of a couple of pillars that had been on either side of her. He painted this as a painting of the wife of the individual who was paying for it. And in this, she is looking outward at us. And that is not how paintings that husbands or fathers would commission of their wives or daughters. They were not done with women looking outward at the viewer. Right? Instead, like we see here, normally they were in profile, normally surrounded by other objects that belonged to the husband or her father. We're in the Renaissance. And the patriarchy is getting stronger in the Renaissance, and so suddenly women in the Renaissance are much more property of men than they were in the Middle Ages. We get to a piece like this, and we're seeing her in profile, and we're seeing her as an object surrounded by other objects because she is the property of her father or she is the property of her husband, and it would have been considered impious of a young woman to be making eye contact with a man who is not her father or her husband. So when Mona Lisa is looking outward at you, that would have been considered almost scandalous. Like, what is she up to? Why is she looking at me? She shouldn't be doing that. That kind of thing. Right? Here's the thing. During the High Renaissance, as I was alluding to in the early Renaissance, art is moving into the universities. Again, you go to the universities to learn a liberal art and how this being art. If you're a woman, there are very few places you can do that. And so suddenly women have a hard time breaking into the art scene in the Renaissance because, A, the patriarchy that says you are property of your father until you are property of your husband is now stronger in the Renaissance than it was in the Middle Ages. And two, the thing that you want to learn, in this case art, is no longer considered a craft. It's now considered a liberal art that you need to go to university to learn, right? And it's because of these genius artists that we're looking at now that shift starts to happen, because they are starting to equate what they do, painting, drawing, sculpture, what have you, with the sciences and with philosophy and all these other pursuits that one had to go to university to learn. So if you stick around with Professor McIntosh and myself next semester, I'll dive into a few women who were working at this point in time as well, and we'll look at the hardships they had to go through in order to even get their artwork out there to be seen. Michelangelo is our third Ninja Turtle. He was born in 1475 and died in 1564. He lived longer than any of the others that were looking. He lived later, I guess I should say. His full name is Michelangelo Buonarroti, but he's Michelangelo. If you say Michelangelo, everyone knows who you're speaking of. Italian sculptor, painter, architect, and poet. He also considered himself a Renaissance man. He was trying to do it all. He was born to a noble family, so he had money, and but then went to Florence to be trained in art, a pursuit that his family didn't always approve of, because again, he was born to this wealthy noble family. They wanted him to continue their name in that way. He trained under a student of Donatello. Right, so Donatello has an apprentice. That apprentice then takes on Michelangelo. So he's only just like one or two steps rather removed from Donatello. Then, when the Medici are expelled from Florence for a little while, there's a little bit of time, he flees that area and then goes and works for many years in Rome, because now again the church the church is looking for art for its purposes at this particular moment in time. And Pope Julius II at this time loves Michelangelo, and he sort of sees Michelangelo as his own personal artist that he has in his pocket. The relationship between these two was a fascinating one, where Michelangelo absolutely resented everything that Pope Julius II was putting him through. But it's the Pope. There's only so much you can say against the Pope, the Vicar of Christ here on earth. This is one of his earliest pieces, the Pietà, where Michelangelo is in his 20s when he makes this. The Pietà is an imagined scene. It's not something that Michelangelo invented. This is a scene that's been used in other artworks. But it's an imagined scene where after Christ has been taken down on the cross, Mary mourns over him. It's not the lamentation, but it's similar thematically. This is Michelangelo's preferred medium. He preferred carving hard stone, like marble, and transforming that hard stone into flesh and fabric. This one in particular he carved for a French cardinal in Rome. And what is interesting about it is that he starts to break away a little bit from some of those Greek and Roman perfect proportions, right? Those mathematical proportions. Now, they're still at pyramid shape, right? The whole thing is in a pyramid, a triangle kind of shape. But he plays around with the proportions. The proportions suit the emotional needs of what he's doing, first and foremost. Because Mary, you'll notice, look, if Mary stood up, that woman would be huge. She'd be like 9 feet tall. She's been made oversized. Why? So that she can cradle Jesus. Jesus, at this point, would be a 33-year-old man, right? But she's cradling him in her lap and mourning over him, and in order to then also call to mind Christ as a baby in Mary's arms, Jesus needs to be a bit smaller. Then, the two of them are idealized, right? Look at Mary over here on the left. That does not look like a woman who could have a 33-year-old son, right? She has been idealized and made to look young, youthful, classically beautiful. And even Christ himself, who by this point should be beaten, battered, and bloody, right, looks like some GQ model who just happens to have fallen asleep to take a nap, right? Right, that's that idealism that's being pulled from ancient Greece, but then you see Michelangelo twisting it to his own purposes, because although he idealized both of them in this way, he didn't idealize them in their proportions. Another one of his very famous pieces is David. This is a sculpture of David, done between 1501 and 1504. Now, two generations, 2 steps before him, Donatello had also done a sculpture of David. I took it out of the lecture because these 2 lectures were just getting out of hand. I needed to edit it down some. But what I explain normally with that particular piece that Donatello did is what I was mentioning a moment ago, that Florence sort of saw itself as David to Rome's Goliath. They saw themselves as constantly fighting with the Roman Catholic Church because they were just too independent. The church wanted to bring them back in and get them under their thumb, and Florence sort of saw themselves as the new, young, up-and-coming sexiness, right? And the old church just needed to leave them alone, let them do their thing. And so whenever you see a Florentine making a statue of David, understand that David is a stand-in for Florence at the time. At this time, Michelangelo is in Rome. He gets called back to Florence. The Medici are back in power again. Florence isn't so much in turmoil anymore, and he is asked to take this block of marble that was in poor condition, and another artist before him had been trying to do something with it and had abandoned it. And they're like, "Can you take this? Can you make something? Can you do a David for us?" And he says, "Sure." He goes for it. He takes this block of marble abandoned by a previous sculptor, and when finished, the Florentine government loved what they had so much that they decided not to put it way up high on the cathedral where it was planned to be, but put it outside the main government building on a much lower level so that everyone would be able to see it. But again, he played around with proportions. And he knew that this was going to be seen when he was making it, at least. The plan was that it was going to be up a high pinnacle on the cathedral in Florence. And so his proportions, you'll notice, aren't quite right. Like, it looks normal enough. We take just a cursory glance. Then you start paying attention to things like the fact that if we look at just David's head and neck, right? And how from the top of his head to the bottom of his neck is almost the same size as his entire torso. Right? And then his legs are like extremely long in comparison. And that's because he was expecting for people to be way down below looking up at this thing. And so the head needed to be much bigger, the legs needed to be much longer, so the whole thing when compressed, because we're looking at it from down below, everything would look correct. The hands, you may notice, look really huge. And one of them's even a little bit, the one here is even a bit larger than the other. But God, Michelangelo taking hard marble, hard substance, and getting it to look like flesh. And not just flesh, but flesh pulled over the musculature and the veins and the bones that he knows to be under there because he has studied anatomy as well. That stuff is incredible. And it's why he's arriving at the right place at the right time as a genius artist at a time when there is a market for that kind of genius. And the look on that face, right? Again, you have to know that whenever you see a Florentine making artwork about David is Florence. Goliath that he's fighting is Rome. And in this case, you can see him. In this case, it's just before the battle with Goliath. He's just about to kill Goliath. And you see him with the sling over his shoulder and him staring off into the distance, we can assume at Goliath, and sizing him up. How am I going to beat this guy? But look how resolute. He's certain that he's going to do this. He's giving Goliath some serious side-eye. And that's how Florence felt at the time. They felt like, we're stronger now. We can take you on, Rome. Just try to come at us, that kind of thing. Another hugely famous piece of his, let me get myself out of the way, is the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. So the Sistine Chapel is the chapel in which all of the cardinals get together to vote on a new pope whenever a new pope is needed. He got called to Rome, Michelangelo, and was told that he was going to be sculpting Julius II's funeral monument. Because he wanted that done before he died, But instead, as I told you, Julius II sort of saw Michelangelo as his personal artist that he could do with as he pleased. And so when Michelangelo arrives, he's like, psych! What I really want you to do is paint this ceiling. Well, Michelangelo says, dude, I'm a sculptor. I'm not a painter, right? This isn't for me. And Julius says, you'll do it, or I won't let you do the funeral sculpture. And what we get is this guy who claims that he is not a painter, who does one of the most incredible and most important pieces of two-dimensional artwork in all of Western history. This ceiling is humongous. It is amazingly detailed. He paints like a sculptor. When you look at these, he's not painting with that chiaroscuro that Da Vinci uses. He's kind of still painting a little bit like Giotto, right? Because he's thinking like a sculptor. He's thinking bulkiness and light and shadow, that kind of thing. And he designed it in a couple ways. He did this where the whole big central portion here that whole portion is made up of scenes that are stories from Genesis, from creation up through the story of Noah's Ark and ending with Noah's drunkenness after the flood. Then either side of this central portion, we have biblical prophets. Here we have some of that Neoplatonism, interestingly, in a building that is synonymous with Christendom, where we have Greek sibyls that are also on the ceiling. And these would have been people whose writings were believed to have foretold Christ's coming. Then we have these triangular portions, and in those we have the different ancestors of Christ. These are the ones who would have been on the Jesse tree that we talked about last week. The biggest piece that everyone is familiar with from this, however, is the creation of Adam, where he did some incredible things. First off, again, as I was saying, you see him painting like a sculptor. He's thinking about hard light, hard shadow, and a pretty harsh line in between, right? His figures also look like they might have been carved out of marble. Like, it's just the way his brain worked. His brain worked like a sculptor, and so the people look like statues. They look like he thought about anatomy when he was making his sculptures. But this particular piece is so well known because of the way he chose to go about portraying the moment of God creating Adam. What does he do? Well, the composition is made such that over here we've got Adam on earth, who hasn't had life breathed into him just yet, so he's very, very limp, doesn't have a lot of strength, and is just barely lifting himself up and is trying to lift his hand up to God and just barely has the energy to do so. God, up here on the right, is just the opposite, right? He's very forward-leaning. He's leaning in, he's sturdy, his arm is out straight and solid, his finger is pointing outward, that he is in control of himself. And we are given this moment where the two fingers are just mere centimeters apart. And we know that as soon as they touch, the idea of all of history, as far as the Judeo-Christian way of thinking goes, is about to launch in that moment. There's more even than that happening here, right? He's contrasting with color, where Adam is on earth, so earth is blues and greens. And then heaven, where God is mostly pink and red and orange, right? A mostly warm palette there to contrast nicely with those cool blues and greens of earth. He also made Adam look like perhaps just a younger version of God, who looks like an older version of Adam. God made man in his image, that sort of thing. And then we know from later panels in this on the ceiling that this up here is Eve, and Eve's already hanging out up here with Adam. The composition here, again, has Adam and God not mirroring one another. It's not as if they both sort of curve inward toward each other. They are both on the same curve, but depending on which side they're on, that curvature of their bodies on Adam's side is indicative of weakness and in needing what God has. And in God's case, that curvature is a motion of action and forward pushing and the giving of that thing that Adam needs. Then, as I say, just because it's interesting, I really particularly love that there are ancient Greek sibyls. These would have been women in ancient Greece whose job it was to be prophets and make prophecies from the gods. That those are included on the ceiling is interesting to me. But I also like pointing out how you look at these different sibyls, like the Delphic sibyl over here on the left and the Libyan sibyl there on the right. And the women, but they sure do look bulky and beefy, right? Well, there's a reason for that. Michelangelo is working in Rome at the time. He's not in Florence, and as such, he can't use female nude models for his sketches. He's having to use men for everything. And so here you see he's got a male model that he then uses for the Libyan sibyl up there, right? It intrigues me. And then lastly, we have Raphael. Raphael, born in 1483 and died tragically young in 1520. His full name was Raffaello Sanzio, but Raphael's what he goes by. He was immensely popular in his lifetime because he brought a lot to the table. His technical skills, his mathematical compositions. Unlike Leonardo, right, who was a procrastinator and never seemed to get things finished, and Michelangelo, who was kind of a hothead and couldn't get along with his patrons often, Raphael was extremely agreeable. He was maybe the consummate yes man, like, yes, I can do that for you. Whatever you say, I'll make it happen. That kind of a guy, right? And his very serene subjects that patrons really enjoyed. He was a young artist among older mentors, and he learned from them and imitated them, and then began to offer other patrons what they wanted from people like Leonardo da Vinci, but he was a much more agreeable guy and was going to get the job done. So here we see, with Madonna in the middle, we see him totally giving us a Leonardo da Vinci, right? Now, understand, I'm not trying to suggest that Raphael is just ripping off other artists. He, as I said, he was young. He was younger than the rest. And so he sees them as his mentors, and he wants to showcase the influence that they have been on his own work. But also, there is a certain amount of patrons who are, say, again, sick of Leonardo da Vinci and his crap, right? They love his work, can't stand that the dude is such a procrastinator and can never seem to get anything done. Here's Raphael saying, I can do it for you. I'll give you what you want. Here's a nice mathematical composition. Here is some botanically correct plants in here. I'll give you some sfumato. I'll give you some chiaroscuro. I'll give you a landscape that feels like one that Leonardo would give you, right? But what you see happening here, the tenderness of this little scene with Mary and Christ and John the Baptist as babies, the tenderness of that is all Raphael. That's what he was particularly good at. He was particularly good at giving us the way I put it is like little pinchable babies. He liked little pinchable babies, whether they be actual babies or whether they be cherubs. And And the sort of intimate scene of Mary looking over these two and giving this slightly concerned look, as if she knows what's in store for them, that John the Baptist is going to die gruesomely for preaching the coming of Christ, and then her son, having become the Christ, will die a horrible death as well. And you can sort of see her looking at them with both a motherly, maternal love, but a little twinge of concern as well. And yeah, his compositions you see being very Leonardo-like, with the math of bringing our eyes upward here and then down to these guys. And if we were stuck down here, their eyes direct us back upward at this stuff, right? And we've got this constant like movement happening in here. That's him learning from the other artists of his time, and then again giving it his flair, that tenderness of a mother holding her child, and a very pinchable, cute baby child at that. And then these little guys, right? So these little cherubs, when they're little baby angels like this, they're called puto. A puto is one. If you have more of them, they're called putti, which I just always love. So we got a couple little putti down here, and that little gem of a scene with these two hanging out down here, and the tenderness and intimacy of that is all Raphael. He brought that kind of thing to the table. But then one of his pieces that he is most well known for are a set of paintings that were not in his style at all. But again, he was asked to do so by the Pope, so you got to do it. Pope Julius sort of saw Raphael as his own personal artist as well. And the School of Athens, or just philosophy, sometimes it's called, is one of a series of paintings that frescoes rather, that he was asked to do in the papal apartments. And at the time it was painted, this particular room housed Pope Julius's personal library, so he wanted a fresco that specifically spoke to knowledge. So it depicts this romanticized idea of Plato and Aristotle's academy, right? Like, a lot of the people who are here, though, would never have been included together. But we have, like, in the middle here, Plato and Aristotle arguing over their stuff, and then there are lots of other famous Greek philosophers from their time and from later generation who are all hanging out. Here's Diogenes just like lounging. on the left right here, we have Plato, as I mentioned, and he's pointing upward, right? He's the one who's saying we should look up. He has his book of cosmology and numerology, mind, spirit, up that way, hence pointing upward. And on the right, we have Aristotle, who you recall was much more grounded. No, like, we don't need to be looking to some other source of everything that we can't prove is there. We just need to look at the world that we live in. The answers are here. And ergo, he's gesturing downward to the ground. They're arguing, but it's good nature. They're equals, right? He painted them literally the same height, and they're looking eye to eye. And interestingly, Raphael included several of the artists of the time that he looked up to as different philosophers within this. So, like, he saw Leonardo, he's using for Plato, because he saw Leonardo as being this wise philosopher. He's got Michelangelo down here as Heraclitus, who was a philosopher and a poet. He added him at the last minute, which is why he's at a different kind of perspective than the rest, but that's actually kind of fitting given what he was trying to do there, because he saw Michelangelo as the contemplative, moody poet. And he painted it also in a different style from the rest of the painting. Look at the rest of these paintings, and then look at the painting of Michelangelo. There, he is copying Michelangelo's style on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. That much more sculptural look, right? That we just don't see in the rest of the painting. And he included a little self-portrait of himself, and he's staring out at us rather than listening to all the other discussions. It's kind of like, yeah, I did this moment. And I like that. I like that about Raphael.
And that's finally it. But anyway, that was the Renaissance. There's so much more we could go into. There's stuff happening in the North during the High Renaissance as well. We didn't even get to touch on mannerism. Maybe I'll try to at least touch on it a little bit before we get into the Baroque. But anyway, yes, that is the end of what you're responsible for from me before the first quiz that you'll take in week 3. All right. Thank you for being patient and making it this far with me. Take care. Bye.